Welcome to episode 38 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes. My plan for 2020 was to cycle the length of Japan. That was cancelled. My plan for 2021 was to cycle the length of Japan. That was cancelled too. So where can your average British cycle tourist, that's me by the way, go in 2021 that ticks the box of adventure but doesn't require any COVID formalities other than buying a ticket and setting off?
It's an absolutely fantastic route.
It is very remote, but it's also one which is great to explore. You'll come across so many things that you've never seen before.
The sea was just incredible.
The scenery was ever changing as well. You go around the corner, there's something else to look at.
But the beaches are just otherworldly.
Everyone's so friendly. I would go back and do the ride again tomorrow if I could.
The Hebrides are all of the islands to the west of the Scottish mainland. The Inner Hebrides include Jura, Mull and Skye. The Outer Hebrides are the chain of islands, 15 inhabited, 50 uninhabited, to the west of Skye that are home to around 27,000 people and, crucially for this podcast, the Hebridean Way. Both the cycling and walking routes of the Hebridean Way start close to the post office on the southern island of Vatersay, continue onto the islands of Barra, Eriskay, South Uist, Benbecula, Grimsay, North Uist, Berneray, Harris and finally Lewis, the most northerly of the chain, where the routes grind to a halt at the butt of Lewis, at which point, to mark the finishing point of the trails, in 1862 David Stevenson had the foresight to build a lighthouse 155 years before the official opening of the Hebridean Way in 2017. In this episode of the Cycling Europe podcast, prior to me setting off on my own journey along the Hebridean Way, I'm going to be talking to a diverse group of writers, travellers and cyclists who all have something to say about the route, the islands and what I might expect to find. We'll also be hearing from the Chief Executive of the Outer Hebrides Tourist Board for the official view. But let's start with two authors who have both not just cycled the Hebridean Way, but written about it as well.
My name is Martin Howe. I enjoy cycling and walking. I really enjoy coastal cycling. So that is why I came to also cycle along the Outer Hebrides from Barra up to the Butt of Lewis and then back to Stornoway before continuing on to John O'Groats.
I'm Pete Martin. Together with my partner, we run a small business writing cycling guides. We call ourselves the Offcomers because we are Offcomers. It's a word used to describe people who aren't native to South Cumbria. We've written cycling guides to Northern Brittany, the Bay Cycleway, Morecambe Bay. And our most successful guide is to cycling the Hebridean Way, the route that runs up the whole of the Outer Hebrides.
It is a spectacular place. I think of all my journeys in Scotland, it has some of the most spectacular beaches in terms of colour and drama. And it is a very remote area, but it's also one which is great to explore. You'll come across so many things that you've never seen before, and you really sort of ease into, the people and the landscape. And it becomes very enjoyable from that point of view. And also I met some fantastic people along the way, particularly staying in a couple of the hostels which are on the route.
The cycling route obviously is pretty much, it's all on roads. and it's an absolutely fantastic route. It's easier in terms of the cycling than you think it might be, with less up and down. But if the wind's against you, it's mind-bogglingly awful. It can be really hellish on a bad day in the Outer Hebrides. I have no hesitation in saying that it's some of the nicest cycling I've ever done, that route.
It's unexpectedly flat. So, except for I think it's Harris, which is, excuse my pronunciation, but at Anclisham, which is the highest point. I'm not sure if it's the highest point, but that's the major lump in the middle. But the rest of it is generally quite flat compared to the west coast of Scotland, which is, obviously far more dramatic in terms of the western Munros.
My name's Peter Adcock. I live in Bristol. I've cycled for many, many years, ever since I can remember, really, to school, to university back in the 70s when it really wasn't the thing to do. Nobody really did that. And for 25 years, I've been cycle touring with some friends. So I'm used to commuting, cycle touring, and I now work part-time as a cycling instructor. So my life is on my bike, basically. Yeah, so I went to the Outer Hebrides in September 2019, so nearly 2 years ago now. I usually go cycle touring with a bunch of friends. There's a sort of group of 5 of us, so whoever's around, it's usually 5, sometimes 4. We've been to France and Germany in recent years. I saw the Outer Hebrides trip on the internet. I thought this would be a good thing to do, so I messaged my friends and said, how about this for the summer, for the autumn? And got a very lukewarm response. Most of them said, actually, no, I don't fancy it. So I had a look into it again. I thought, actually, do you know what? I'd like to go there. So one rainy, wet, cold day in January 2019, I went on the internet, did some research, booked my accommodation for September, and off I went. It turned out to be my first solo trip. I've done 2 since then. I thoroughly enjoyed being on my own, and I thoroughly enjoyed the Outer Hebrides. I'd recommend it to anybody.
My name's Campbell Hutchison. I'm originally from Glasgow and now living in Galashiels. And I'm now a writer and playwright and a keen cyclist. Well, somebody coming from south of this country to Glasgow will arrive at Glasgow Central Station, and a lot of people seem to think that Central's the end, but it's not really. It's a terminus, and from there you have to go to Queen Street Station, which is only a 5-minute walk away. And Queen Street itself opens the traveller to the whole of the north of Scotland. If they want to go to the islands, they'll head up the West Highland line. They'll go to Oban or Mallaig, and in this case, you're going to Oban, and it's a fantastic journey. The good news for travellers with bikes is ScotRail has started a new service called the Highland Explorer, and this is a carriage in itself that's set aside for people that might be taking their bikes or perhaps the winter skis. I think there are places for 20 bikes, so half the carriage. You have to accommodate the people that are willing to get out, and the active travel is something that the company seems to be pursuing. And this has been introduced on the Oban service, so you're off to a flyer there.
I live in Bristol, which is a fair way from the Hebrides, Outer Hebrides. So I had a choice: either take my own bike. How do I get it there? I could go on the train. My experiences with taking bikes on trains in this country isn't great. That I don't particularly think that the train companies in this country are particularly well geared up to taking bikes. I could have driven somewhere, long way to drive on your own, leave a car somewhere. The other option was to hire. So I looked into that and did find a place called Taynuth. I think it's how you pronounce it, Tayniuth, the Rusty Cycle Shack. And that's 1 or 2 stops before you get to Oban on the train. So what I did, I went to Oban, stayed the night, got the train back to Taynuth, then cycled back into Oban and took my bike across on the ferry to Barra. But while I was there, I did meet a few people who'd hired from Barra bikes. They highly recommended. They flew in from Glasgow to Barra, landed on the beach, and then Barra bikes picked them up. So bike hire is certainly an option.
I'm Steve Pollock. I live in New Forest in Hampshire, southern England. I did the Hebridean Way in 2019 with my partner and friends. We've done a few, not mega long tours, but we've done a few tours of similar sort of distance over to Paris, up to Amsterdam, that sort of thing. When we did the Hebridean Way, because we live in south of England, we actually chose to fly up. So we flew initially Southampton to Glasgow, and then we were privileged enough to do the flight across from Glasgow to Barra and land on the beach there. The timetable to fly in is depending on the tide. Obviously, high tide, there's no beach, there's no planes land. Low tide, planes can go in. You come in on a For most people, probably the smallest plane they've ever flown on. I think there was 14 people on it when we flew. Landing on the beach was a special experience. You're looking out the window, you're coming in over the islands, you're seeing the scenery, and then you come down, and as the wheels touch, there's spray splashing up, and it's just so unlike any landing you've seen anywhere, any plane you'll have been on before. We got off the plane and there was time for us to wander around the beach, take photos, look at the plane. You go into the terminal is tiny. You walk through, there's a cafe where people come to actually watch the planes taking off and landing. We'd hired bikes, we'd used a company to do all the logistics for us. So we hired bikes, we walked through the terminal and there was 2 bikes there waiting for us with our names on. And we cycled off.
Hi, I'm Rich Kembleton.
And I'm Carrie Kembleton.
And almost a spur of the moment thing. My parents lived in Glasgow at the time, and we got a train up to Glasgow, borrowed my parents' bikes, which were heavy steel mountain bikes, but with pannier racks, and got the train up to Oban, ferry out to Barra, cycle around Barra the first day, and checked the ferry times onto the next island, but found it wasn't running the next day.
So we had an impromptu extra day in Barra.
But it does have the best airport in the UK, which is just a very flat, low-lying beach. And the beaches out in the Outer Hebrides are wonderful. It's glorious white sand that stretches on for miles and miles and miles. And on Barra, that's the airstrip. So the flights to and from the island are timed for low tide because the plane can't take off and land at high tide because the beach is underwater. And at that time, you could turn up at the airfield, and if the plane wasn't full, the plane flew from Glasgow out to Barra, up to Benbecula and back again. If the plane wasn't full, you could pay 50 quid and get a flight to Benbecula and back, which took about an hour all in. And we found out there was space on the plane, so we left our bikes at the airfield and got on and had a 15-minute flight north with the pilot telling us which side of the aeroplane we could sit on for the best views. And it's really interesting to see the islands from the air because you really get a sense that they are, at least in the south end, up until you get to Lewis and Harris, they're just giant sandbars. They're very flat, very low lying. There's lots of lochs, and they really don't catch the weather much at all because they're so low lying. There's nothing to push the air up and form storms and rain clouds. And that's part of why cycling there is so nice, because you've got a prevailing wind from the southwest. It's a tailwind going from south to north. There aren't very many hills.
We spent the whole week in pretty much unbroken sunshine looking over at the mainland, and you can see the mainland, and Scotland was just a perpetual black thunderstorm the whole time that we were there. So yeah, it's really nice. It's a completely different ecosystem to most of what you experience in Scotland.
My name's Robert McKinnon. I'm head of Outer Hebrides Tourism, helping promote the islands and develop tourism within the islands. Each of the islands has their own character, and that reflects the different history of the islands. They only came together as a single body in 1973. So therefore, each of them has links into different areas. If you're going to Barra, you go from Oban. You go to Stornoway, you go from Ullapool. So the Hebridean Way was one of the things that was created to sort of try and join up the islands and could strengthen them rather than just being part of a council area.
First impressions were excellent. I mean, you see the Outer Hebrides looming on the horizon. They get bigger and bigger and bigger. So you're well prepared. I mean, the journey out on the ferry is fantastic. So save every moment of that. But you come off into Castle Bay, then cycle up a small slope into Castle Bay itself. And then, the scenery the scenery all the way along the route is fantastic. But I checked into the Castle Bay Hotel, which is almost opposite the ferry port. And my first impression was, it seems to be just such a maybe trusting kind of place. For instance, I went to check in and said, where can I lock my bike up? She said, what do you mean lock your bike up? I said, well, I like to, we don't need to lock your bike up. People leave their front doors open. They don't lock the bikes up. In fact, I stayed in one bed and breakfast, and I went for a meal in the pub around the corner, 50 yards down the road or something. It was chucking it down with rain. And the lady said, well, I'm playing bingo in the village hall opposite. My car's unlocked. Just sit in the car and I'll give you a lift back at 9 o'clock. It was just like no front doors locked, no, nothing locked, just so friendly. And everybody I met was really, really interested in what I was doing, where I was going, where I was from, what I was doing, why I was doing it as well. But the first impressions really were the scenery and just the hills and the grass and the sea, and just fantastic.
If you're thinking about making the trip, there are a couple of books to help you do the planning. We have maps available to help you on the route. And then, yeah, just look out for the blue signs. We started off as part of the National Cycle Network. We were demoted. It was National Cycle Network 780. And if you look for that, you'll still see quite a lot on the web about that. But now the signs in place are exactly that kind of sign, which you would be used to seeing elsewhere. But the red oval has been replaced with the Hebridean Way logo. And there are pillars that start and finish the route. So one in Vatersay, right in the south, and one at the north at the lighthouse at Ness.
Once we landed, we got our bikes. The airport's actually quite a way up Barra, and the Hebridean Way starts at Vatersay, which is the island below Barra, linked by causeway. We wanted to do the whole route, so we actually rode down south to the start of the route at Vatersay. I think each day we did about 35 miles. We averaged about 35 miles. We took detours here and there to go and see things that were marked on the map or things that we'd heard about from other cyclists. What we found is we were seeing the same people every day. When you get in the ferries, you are sort of dictated by timetable. So people will be coming onto the same ferries, you'd see them, and you see them for the next couple of days till you got the next ferry. We used a mix of hotels, B&Bs, a couple of bunk houses, accommodation. Everyone was friendly. It was good fun.
The cyclists I met on the ferry going across to Barra, many of them were actually being sort of quite, well, not purist about it, but they were, first of all, cycling to Vatersay. And there's quite a good couple of places there to wild camp, and it's a beautiful beach as well. But I just progressed straight on to that campsite that I knew because it was part of a longer journey. And I wanted to get the ferry first thing in the morning across to South Uist. But there's certainly plenty of opportunities to wild camp, particularly down by the beaches. You'll have a great experience if the weather's good.
The beaches on the west coast of South Harris are really, they're justifiably famous because they are this fantastic shell sand, beautiful white beaches, the seas rolling in. There's these mountains in the distance. On a sunny day, you could be in the Caribbean or anywhere. On the other hand, the Golden Road, the eastern side, is a twisting, turning, narrow, up and down. You have to think what you're doing with every pedal stroke. Route through rock and bog and lily ponds, and it's a really harsh landscape. Stanley Kubrick used it to film Jupiter in 2001. You won't find anywhere else like it, certainly where people live in the United Kingdom. But Harris it's a whole. You can't have one without the other. It's a bit yin and yangy in a way. And the reason, partly, why the western side beaches are so empty and you get such a feeling of space is because all the people were cleared out of it in the 1830s. And a lot of them went over and scraped a living on the eastern side. And that's where there's more habitation. You get a feeling of understanding the landscape and what's gone on by going up that Golden Road. The cycling's in a way more interesting as well, and your understanding of the landscape will be better. Besides which, if it's really blowing a hoolie from the west, you'll want to be on the nice sheltered side. Why it's called the Golden Road, opinion is divided. Was it a Glasgow newspaper saying, this is outrageous, we're spending so much money on paving the road for where nobody lives? Or was it locals with a marvellous sense of humour saying, it would cost as much to pave this in gold as it does in tar? Who knows?
Most of the time we managed to find a post office or a corner shop or something somewhere where you could get food. Or we sometimes stayed in B&Bs, which meant you could have an enormous breakfast and hope that you got through till dinner, or smuggle out a few sausages. There was one evening when we had to chase the local delivery van around, didn't we?
Around the village.
There was no shop. There was just a van, and we had to cycle around the village chasing this van, looking at it a kilometre away and saying, it's over there, and started cycling following it. And then by the time we get there, it would be gone. And then we got to it, and in the end, there was just an apple pie left, wasn't there? So we had apple pie for dinner.
We think it's about 5,000 people who come each year, which for us is quite a significant proportion of the visitor traffic that we get. We measure people on the ferries actually, and we get quite a good view just on how many bikes there are on each crossing, can give us a reasonable view of how many people are doing the route. Obviously, you don't have to do it in one go. Some people come and do the southern half first and then do the other half. So what we're seeing, and I think maybe one of the things that we didn't expect, is just the diversity of cyclists who come. So there are club cyclists who come and want to do it in the minimum number of days and get up there and speed past. And there are other people who want to do it in different chunks and maybe just do part of the route. The people on e-bikes, which is a much bigger part of the traffic than we would have expected. I hope we're getting a reputation for inclusiveness. It really doesn't matter how you do it. So as you go around the islands, you see a much broader range of cyclists than perhaps I was expecting when we started this off.
From starting cycling on Barra to reaching Stornoway, having gone to the Bus of Lewis, was 3 days. But I did have a very strong tailwind. In fact, half of the journey on South Uist and North Uist, I'm barely pedaling, to be honest. It would have been quite a different matter if I was going the other way. But the timing and the number of days that you'll spend on the island is very much about being quite cute in terms of catching the ferries, because sometimes, if you miss a ferry, that could easily add half a day to your journey. And I was taking quite a direct route, I would say, but I would encourage people to explore a lot of the roads which lead off to remoter places. So, for example, Uig is a beautiful place to go, where there's a lovely sandy beach. And there's also some alternatives to the main route which you can follow that go down very remote single track roads where you're unlikely to see another car for an hour or so. But you could easily spend more than a week on the island if you really wanted to fully explore it.
The scenery, I mean, the beaches, the ever-changing scenery, the beaches, the hills, the maca, which is the long grass, wildflowers, which you'll see sort of in the central islands. Absolutely fantastic to cycle through there with the flowers and the swishing grass. The scenery is ever-changing as well. You go around a corner, there's something else to look at. In fact, at some point you get a bit blasé about it. Oh yeah, another beautiful beach, another hill. And the remoteness as well. I mean, you are on an island, but you can be remote at times, and it's just great just being on your own, going down a hill, going up a hill, sitting on a beach. I went to Luscantire Beach. I was the only person on that beach, and I don't know if you realise, but that's supposed to be one of the finest beaches in Europe. Just sat there on my own for 10 minutes. Fantastic.
We would definitely suggest that people plan and book ahead. The islands are more popular than lots of people think. So some people turn up expecting to be the only person coming, and particularly in the summer months, they are a popular holiday destination and you need to get in. So if you are the sort of person who is, the real hardcore people who are going to camp the whole time are probably okay. But if you're the sort of person who, if the weather's not that great and you want a night in a bed just to get a bit better, you probably can't do that at the last minute. You have to make a decision beforehand. And if the weather's not good and you want a hot shower and a bed. So definitely think and be honest with you about the kind of person that you are. Some people start to go, oh yes, I'm going to camp the whole way and I don't need to do anything, and be self-sufficient. And then they sort of lose their enthusiasm a bit. So just ask people to be a bit realistic, and ask people to be a bit considerate about the place. I think there is a practical understanding on the islands that plans change and people miss ferries and weather and all those things. So you can't necessarily plan it to the last detail, but certainly if you choose to camp where you choose to camp, go off the route and find a bit away from the route. Don't stay in villages. Plan early. Our preference is to book. And if you do find, there are some parts which are quite remote, and if you do find you need to stay somewhere, then be thoughtful in selecting those things. Just don't just fall off your bike and pitch at the side of the road.
We hadn't really realised what Sunday meant. And then we were in a B&B that morning. We didn't have any sandwiches with us. We didn't have anything to cook that evening for dinner. We were planning on camping and we had nothing. So obviously we were keeping our eye out for a shop or a post office or something, and nothing. Everything was shut. Just everywhere was dead. There was not a soul to be seen. Finally, we came across it was a tiny little village museum or something, and it was open. So we went in and we said, excuse me, can you just please tell us where we might be able to get something that we can buy to eat? And so these two little old ladies looked at each other and scratched their heads and kind of looked back at us in surprise that we apparently didn't realise that there was no chance that we were going to buy any food.
They did offer us tea and coffee.
They offered us tea and coffee, yeah. And then we said, right, okay, well, this is a problem because we've got another like 40k to cycle or something before we can get to anywhere. Like, okay, we're going to have to stay in a hotel tonight, decision. And then they said, well, actually, no, there is something you could do. You could go back a couple of kilometres to the garage on the corner, and there was only 2 roads, so it was obvious where it was, and buy a microwave meal there and bring it back here, and we'll stay open for you, and you can bring it here and we'll microwave it for you. And that is exactly what we did. We cycled a couple of kilometres in the wrong direction.
Against the headwind.
Against the headwind. Bought a couple of microwave meals, took them back, and they very, very judiciously microwaved them for us. And we sat in this little museum while they knitted and we ate microwave lasagna or whatever it was.
There are a couple of bits of the routes which are quite remote. So the islands overall are reasonably well populated, but you definitely need to think about those things and where you're going to stop for lunch, toilet stops, all those kinds of things. In some parts of the route are quite frequent and you'll be fine, but there's certainly 2 parts, so the bit between Talbot and Stornoway, between Harris and Lewis. You know, you're going up into the mountains there, and that's some of the hardest cycling and also the wildest country that you're in. So you will have probably 15, 20 miles without really anything, pretty much a wilderness. So it's very spectacular. It's one of the highlights of most people's visits. You have to be ready for that. So when you see a place, think about, do we need anything, rather than just go past it, because you might be a while before there's the next one.
As a cyclist, the wind is the thing that can be your enemy. It can be your friend, but it's unlikely to be your friend. And if you're not used to flat places by the sea, the constant nature of the wind, even on a still day, you've got a very still day is wind of 5 to 10 miles an hour constantly from one direction. So you never get those still periods. It can be quite a long way between places. That's particularly true with the walking route, less so on the cycling route. You can always put in a bit of a spurt and nip off somewhere to go next. But the walking routes, it's kind of days before the official route meets a shop. And you're in somewhere that is different. It's not like the Outer Hebrides are noticeably different from the rest of Britain. You know, I can remember the first time going there 40 odd years ago and actually being a bit taken aback by the fact that this place is different. And you know, in Harris and Lewis, everything stops on a Sunday. Really, everything stops on a Sunday. It's like anywhere else in Britain. It's got all the modern things are there, but you kind of feel as though you're a bit closer to how things maybe ought to be. You know, there's more wildlife than there is where either you or I live, for example. It's that you're there on the edge often. People are a bit more, they're a bit less reserved. Things are a bit more open. And yeah, you know, things have changed a great deal. I mean, there's a lot, you don't see the people living in corrugated iron houses anymore, which you did 40 years ago. There's less obvious grinding poverty than there was 40 years ago, which is probably true for most places. It is a different place, and there are different cultures, and you kind of need to bear that in mind at times, that people do things a bit differently.
The weather generally was breezy, sunny, not hugely hot, much cooler, you know, a few degrees cooler than Bristol, noticeably cooler. I did get very wet one on my 3rd or 4th day. I think we had heavy showers. The ferry from Barra and Eriskay, the last one of the day, was cancelled because of high winds, and they're flat bottom things, so they're very susceptible to winds and chop on the sea. Luckily, I got there early because I'd heard rumours from other cyclists that they were going to chop the ferry, so I got an extra ferry they laid on. One day I had 50-mile-an-hour tailwinds, which is fantastic. Just blew me along, and heavy rain. But a lot of cyclists I met weren't going to cycle that day for that reason, but I went for it, and very glad I did, actually. I was going across the Isle of Lewis. Fantastic. But generally it was bright and sunny, breezy, but be prepared for everything. Somebody did mention Four Seasons one day. I didn't quite get that, but I got a good selection of weather.
I guess one of the big things that everyone's heard about on Lewis is the Callanish stones. We were there a couple of days after midsummer. There was pretty much 24-hour daylight. We wanted to go and see the stones at sunset, but there is no sunset, and obviously in the middle of June on Harris and Lewis. But the stones themselves are spectacular. I live down south. I've seen Stonehenge. I've seen Avebury. Callanish, I think, is more impressive. Obviously, something that Harris is known for is the tweed. There are rules and regulations about what's allowed to be called Harris tweed in terms of who makes it. You've got to be trained. I think it used to be that only men could make it and things like that. On the route, there is a local who's still making the tweed on an old-fashioned loom in basically a shed in his garden. And it's signposted off the route, and you can go in there and he gives talks, demos about making the tweed. The guy's probably in his 70s, 80s. I'd be very surprised if he's not deaf, because actually the loom itself is very noisy with the shuttles banging backwards and forwards. But you can go in and just watch him and learn about the making of the tweed for 20 minutes. It's fascinating. We were aware of 2 gin distilleries on the whole of the route. There's a relatively new, I think it's only been a few years now, a gin distillery at Barra, and it's in Castle Bay. We didn't go on a tour. I don't know whether you can go on a tour, but we were able to visit the shop at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning and sample the wares. Couldn't take a bottle away with us because A, it's quite heavy in the pannier, and B, we were flying out to the islands at the end of the holiday. But there's also another gin distillery in Tarbert on Harris, and I believe you can do tours there. It's also a good place. It's got a nice restaurant you can go in. So if you need a lunch or a snack midway through the day, it's got a good place to visit for that. Again, you can sample the wares and buy the wares if you want.
I think there's a temptation when you're on a cycling route to get to the end of the route. And actually, some of the interesting stuff is just turn off the route, which psychologically just stops you having to rush. You're not trying to get somewhere. So, if you're on a club cyclist and you want to do it as a group, there's a reason to do it fast. But even some of the other cyclists, they sort of begin to get into a schedule. And I think some of the pleasure is just not being on a schedule. So do take some of the side routes off. This is the main route through the islands that you're on, and take the back route. In South Harris, there are 2 routes. There's the actual official way, and then there's another back road that you can take. Make sure you do it your way. Don't have the same experience as everybody else. There's an Eagle Hide. It's about a 5-mile ride down one of the side roads, and you can go in and watch the eagles nesting. One of the things that surprises people is the number of honesty boxes along the way. Most people leave eggs or baking or those kinds of things, and quite often it can be actually being a microwave ovens are usually repurposed for this thing. So if you see a microwave oven at a gate post, it's usually got something interesting in it that's worth exploring. But do stop and use those things, and partake of fresh eggs. Might not be practical on your bike, but if you're near the end of the route and you want a couple of eggs for breakfast, honesty boxes are a big part of island life. Talk to people. Just pass the day. One of the things that people like about the route is the chance just to chat for a bit. Don't let your schedule become your master.
I think number 1 is probably Callanish Stone Circle, which is the second most important stone circle in the whole of the British Isles.
And the beaches. I mean, you can't name one beach over any of the others. Just the coastline, and there's obviously a lot of coastline, but the beaches are just otherworldly.
There's a reconstructed black house village, and you can stay in one of the black houses as a small youth hostel or camp outside it. If you do that, I'd recommend staying in the old human end, not the animal end, because the walls are a lot thicker and it's warmer. We made the mistake of going to the empty end on a cold night, and
there was a good reason why it was empty, because it was cold and wet and damp. And we didn't sleep at all, only to be told the next morning that we should have been outside anyway because we'd missed the Northern Lights. But never mind.
So closest I've ever come to seeing the Northern Lights.
Yes, I mean, one of the highlights was to stay at the Gatliff Trust Hostel, which is on Berneray. You can't book it. You just turn up. You can camp nearby, as a contingency, let's say, but you kind of wander into one of the sort of rebuilt black houses, almost, as they're called, and put your stuff. If there's a spare bunk, then you put your stuff on it, and then you meet in a common room, And usually there's a good bunch of people in there, and as was the case when I turned up. And it was a wonderful evening, sharing stories and actually doing monster jigsaw puzzles together and cooking together and talking together. And it was really nice, cozy experience with a beautiful peat fire going within it.
You've got to go to Callanish and you've got to spend some time there, because that stone circle is quite an amazing thing. With the exception of Stonehenge and Avebury, I can't think of a more dramatic stone circle. Spending some time on those beaches is something that you have to do. And there's lots of places where you can get into the fantastic beach world. And I'm not going to say do this beach rather than that beach, but make sure that certainly if the sun's shining, you spend a good hour somewhere pottering around on one of those beaches. And I think the wildlife is really good. You know, the bird life is absolutely fantastic. And again, I'd say, just stop. What I really find quite difficult is people bombing up and down the Hebridean Way in 24 hours, 48 hours. Obviously, I'm impressed by the way that people have done that. But actually, you're passing lots of interesting things. You're passing places where lots of really interesting people who are probably quite happy to stop and have a conversation with you. The place is dripping with history, and you need to make a little bit of effort to find that history and that wildlife and those people. So I'd say make time. That's the thing to do. Spend some time, stop, go on some detours.
If you're someone who likes being outdoors, the Hebrides are just fantastic. There's a vast variety of scenery. So you've got the hills on Harris and Lewis. You've got some mountains. I mean, it goes up to 800 meters, something like that. The Uist, the flat, you can see for miles and miles and miles. The lochs, the Macaire. It's also different from what we have in southern England, at least. I thought it was fantastic. There's wildlife all over the place. We were fortunate enough to see eagles on a couple of occasions. We saw a golden eagle and we saw some sea eagles. Everyone's so friendly. I would go back and do the ride again tomorrow if I could.
For a fair proportion of the route now, you will have a 3 or 4G signal, but there are bits of it where there are gaps. And obviously, if you live here, you learn to know those gaps. But for the first time, it can be a bit frustrating. You can't rely on it at every point along the route, but it won't be too far. There's not massive black spots. In most cases, it might be a mile or a couple of miles that you're out, and then you'll be back into some kind of coverage. Definitely for calls and probably for data. The network is a bit better in the north than in the south.
When we got up to Stornoway at the end of the trip, obviously, that was the time when they were just about to start Sunday flights to Stornoway. And the people in Stornoway were all in favour of this. It meant they could get Sunday newspapers, people could come and visit for the weekend. But the local vicar was not so pleased, and he was out protesting and saying that Sunday flights, you're not allowed, you should keep the Sabbath holy and so on. One of the local newspapers asked him if he would be out protesting at the very first flights. And he said, oh, no, you can't protest on the Sabbath either. Another reason there were mixed opinions about Sunday in Stornoway was that there was the Stornoway Golf Club, which of course was not open on a Sunday. You weren't supposed to play there. But the practical upshot of that was that it meant the clubhouse wasn't open. There was no one to collect the green fees and no one around either to enforce that you shouldn't play there. So it was extremely popular because Sunday was the free day for playing golf. And it was probably busier on a Sunday than any other day.
I arrived at the Butt of Lewis at about 5:30, I think. I had already booked a trip back with a bunch called Heb Shuttle. They run bus services from north and south from Butt of Lewis to Barrow and back again. When I was at the Butt of Lewis, I bumped into a couple of other cyclists who were also waiting for the bus. So they took us to Stornoway for that night. So we got to Stornoway probably 6:30 or something in the evening. And then in the morning, about 6 o'clock, they picked me up from where I was staying. The other two guys were staying in Stornoway and were getting a ferry across to Ullapool, I believe. And then during the day, they took me back to the Eriskay to Barrow ferry. There's no point in them taking me to Barrow on the ferry and back again. So they left me at Eriskay. I got the ferry across and then cycled back to Castlemaine. It took probably the best part of a day, and we picked up another cyclist along the way. He came to Barrow with me. But the original reason for the shuttle is that they deliver and collect laundry and do the laundry and give it back to B&Bs and guest houses and such. So we did some laundry delivery at various places along the way as well. So it's quite an entertaining day out.
Whatever you do, don't come back. I'm not sure if you're a vegetarian, but if you're not a vegetarian, don't come back without trying some of the black pudding, particularly the black pudding sausage rolls. So when you're cycling back from the Butt of Lewis, I think there's a shop that's on the left-hand side down a lane, and you walk in there and they've just got trays of fresh, made that morning black pudding sausage rolls, and it's the most delicious thing you'll ever taste. And it certainly perks you up.
Reaching the northern end of Harris as well is a nice thing. There's a fantastic lighthouse there to mark the end of the trip. Then you've got to turn around and go back to Stornoway again. And then you get the ferries from Stornoway back to Ullapool, and you come into Ullapool and you have your fish and chips on the pier, because of course you do, because that's what you do in Ullapool. And get on your bike and cycle to Garve to get the train back down to Glasgow again. And you'll find as you leave Ullapool, on this lovely wide road, there's a sign there saying, drive on the left. And you ask yourself how many international ferries there are that come into Ullapool that need this kind of warning. And a few years later, we did do a trip around the north of Scotland and found that Ullapool is where it stops being single track road again to the north, and you join the dual track road. And that's why there's a reminder there to drive on the left, because otherwise you might have forgotten.
People that manage to complete the Hebridean Way are obviously at the top of Lewis, and the nearest settlement there is Stornoway. So the best place to get back to the mainland is to go from Stornoway to Ullapool. But the problem with Ullapool is they don't have a railway station there. They've tried many times, but particularly during the Victorian era, and nothing ever came off. So the cyclists can either cycle over towards Inverness or get the bus. So that's the option from there. And if somebody wanted to go over, such as yourself, you've decided to catch the train at the Garve station, that's on the Kyle line, and the Kyle line connects with Inverness. Once you're in Inverness, you'll be able to go just about anywhere, in your case, back to Glasgow. The scenery and the mountains area just doesn't give up. Once you've left Inverness and you're heading down towards Aviemore, you're into deep valleys with huge mountains. It's very much that all the way into Perthshire, supposedly definitely one of the nicest counties in Scotland. And you're into Pitlochry and Perth and back down through the Central Belt and Stirling to Glasgow.
I think I'd spend more time doing the whole journey if I went back again. And I really would like to go back again. Like I mentioned earlier on, I spent a bit of time, 10 minutes or so, literally on Luscantire Beach. I'd love to spend more time just exploring the beaches and more of the scenery, and take some side trips as well, because my days were fairly full on. I was cycling for 5 days, I think. So there wasn't a huge amount of time to look at other things along the way. I mean, I stopped at the Callanish Stones, for instance, which everybody should do. But yeah, I would go back and take longer. Even though they're small islands, there's still loads of things I didn't do and I'd like to do more of.
Keep listening, because this episode of the Cycling Europe podcast is far from over. But thanks to all the people you've heard so far. That's the writers Martin Howe and Pete Martin. Martin Howe has a new book coming out on the 2nd of September. It's called Tales from the Big Trails and recounts his 40-year quest to walk the iconic long-distance trails of England, Scotland and Wales. It's published by Vertebrate Publishing. For more information about Pete Martin's guidebooks, including the one he wrote about cycling the Hebridean Way, visit his website theoffcomers.co.uk. Thanks also to Richard and Carrie Kembleton, who dialed in from Munich of all places, Peter Adcock, Campbell Hutchison, Steve Pollock and Rob McKinnon from Outer Hebrides Tourism. Online, the organisation can be found at visitouterhebrides.co.uk, and that site includes pages dedicated to the Hebridean Way, both the cycling and walking versions, where, amongst other things, you can buy a map of the route for just £3.99, which is what I just did before recording this. Now, after hearing all those people talk, you might be thinking that the Hebridean Way is best left to those people who have at least a bit of cycle touring experience under their belts. Well, think again. To finish this episode of the Cycling Europe podcast, sit back with a glass of wine. Red will be appropriate, and you'll find out why in a few minutes. and listen to the chat that I had with Sue Carson. She and her 2 friends arrived on Barra with no cycle touring experience whatsoever.
My name is Sue Carson, and I try and get outdoors as much as I can at any point of the week. I work with children outdoors.
And a slight disclaimer to begin with, because we do actually know each other, and we have known each other for quite a long time, although this is the first time we've spoken in probably 5 or 6 years, I would imagine, because we did used to work at the same secondary school in Henley-on-Thames quite a few years ago. But now you've moved on and you're working in a different job, I think.
I have. I've decided I need to get out of the classroom. I'm still doing a similar job, working with young people. But yeah, I work outdoors. So if I can get in a canoe, get on a bike, or light a campfire, that's usually my day.
We're talking about August 2018 here, and you decide with a couple of friends, a couple of female friends, to head up to the Outer Hebrides and cycle along the Hebridean Trail. First of all, where did the idea come from? What was the motivation for doing it in the first place?
It was my friend's idea, actually. So she had obviously been looking into having an adventure. She came up with the Outer Hebrides. She mentioned that she quite liked the idea of going there. I just love cycling, and she kind of sounded me out for how would I feel about accompanying her going cycling on the Hebridean Way. So I said, yeah, absolutely. Having said that, they have not done a lot of cycling. So I went with 2 other girls who have cycled mostly on road, but as I say, not a huge amount. So yeah, I was very excited. I mean, I love to get out on my bike. I prefer off-road to on-road. So yeah, I was really up for the challenge.
And had you done any cycle touring before?
Never. So I've done no cycle touring. My other half is quite into cycling. We've done lots of Audaxes, so I knew I could do the distance. So I think I felt confident about the distances. But yeah, my 2 other friends were not huge cyclists. So, but I thought they're islands. There's no great gradients to climb, so we should be okay.
Did you do much preparation? Did you just kind of turn up at Urban and buy a ticket, or did you actually do much preparation in advance?
I did loads of preparation. Obviously, because I was concerned we didn't want to cycle too many miles in one day. Obviously, because you're only as quick as your slowest person on the bike. So we didn't want to set too big distances. But yeah, loads of preparation, because obviously once you start looking into the Outer Hebrides, there are a huge number of islands, which obviously involves a huge number of causeways, ferries, timings. I actually at one point realised what a logistical nightmare it is, because I am not a planner, and I hate being pinned down to a timetable and planning, but this was actually really good. Having said that, I'm not very good at planning, not very good at organising, but this was a really good project to sort of work on those skills. Having said that, the first night that I arrived at my friend's, she was busy fixing a leaking car outside. And I just thought, I'll just take the opportunity to just check, we have got all the right dates and the right hotels and what have you. I was going through the schedule and I realised I'd actually booked our last night's hotel on the wrong date. So it was at this point I was thinking, shall I confess to my friend or shall I just quietly phone and rebook it? So I did. I quietly phoned and rebooked it while she was out fixing her car leak. But yeah, it's a huge challenge, I would say, and a pretty mad one to do for your first cycling tour.
Why didn't you choose something, I don't know, why didn't you choose something nice and easy, like somewhere in Devon or Cornwall? What made you choose the Outer Hebrides, which in terms of its location is challenging, in terms of the weather potentially challenging, in terms of the terrain challenging?
If you're going to do something, you need to do it in style, don't you? So I don't, yeah, it would have been far more sensible to do something closer to home, do a couple of nights over. But actually, it was the excitement of the challenge, actually, that I found personally really exciting about doing it. The Outer Hebrides is obviously a stunning place. I've been to the Scilly Isles for a very short family holiday, and that I just, the remoteness and just being in, it's almost like a different time. It's like going back 100 years. So I just thought, the Hebrides has got to be like this. So that was the draw for me. It's such a special place. And because it's so inaccessible, that made it all the more exciting.
Okay, so you take the ferry from Oban and you arrive in Castle Bay with your two friends. What happens next? Tell us the story of your 6, 7, 8 days on the Outer Hebrides.
Well, we didn't really know how much time to allow cycling, deviating from the route, and then getting to your destination. How much leeway you can allow and to meander. So we were a bit obsessed with not missing the ferries. You miss a ferry, it could lead to the whole schedule going to pot. We weren't overly obsessed with completing the Hebridean Way. So we didn't actually cycle to the start, which actually I'd quite like to go back and do now. So we would quite like to start from the very, very beginning of the ride. Ours was more about just the whole adventure. We set off, and one of the places we wanted to visit was Barra Airport, because that is absolutely spectacular. And we were hoping that we would get to see a plane land on the beach. I just have to point out the weather prior to our trip was absolutely stunning. I think we had a heat wave in 2018. Of course, the day before we went, you can imagine what happened to the weather. It completely changed. However, we did end up on Barra Beach Airport, which, if you're going over there, I really recommend you go. They've got an amazing cafe. You can sit, drink coffee and look out, and it's absolutely stunning. So yeah, that was one of our first memorable trips.
And did you see a plane?
We did see a plane land. Yes. So that was amazing. I think one of the most other memorable moments for me was I'm shooting right ahead now, because we got up to the Isle of Harris. We didn't actually make it up to Lewis, but on our Isle of Harris beach, obviously the weather was really awful, but the bonus of that was that the sea had brought in a really unusual amount of these sail fin jellyfish. They were amazing, absolutely beautiful little blue jellyfish with sails that sit up, and they were all over the beach, absolutely stunning. So that was really special. Yeah, and it's a really remote beach, but completely covered with these beautiful, beautiful little jellyfish.
Did you have any problems along the way?
Oh, yeah, where's my list? We had a few. Yeah, weather. That was probably the most eventful incident, because we did actually arrive on Vatersay late in the evening. Beautiful little island. We had a B&B that overlooked the sea. I can remember sort of looking out at the sunset thinking, can't wait to cycle tomorrow. It's absolutely stunning. The sea was like a mill pond, absolutely beautiful. And then, of course, we woke up the next morning, and before we'd open the curtains, you could hear the wind. Literally, it was blowing a hoolie. Open curtains, the sea was just incredible. We had a causeway to cycle over, so that was okay. At least we weren't sort of ferry dependent, but it was literally 40-mile-an-hour winds. So undeterred, we set off. And of course, the thing about booking your accommodation is, you have to go. So we had a 30-mile bike ride, which we just had to get on with because our next hostel was booked. And actually, accommodation is quite limited there. I don't know what you've read, but actually that was also a little bit of anxiety for our trip, was booking ahead and having to be at a certain destination for a certain time. So anyway, we set off, and it was the most horrendous winds. Ended up in the local co-op, dripping with rain. It was bitterly cold. My friend's nose was turning blue. She looked like she's hypothermic. So we decided to abandon the ride and try and call a taxi. And they do have special taxis over there, but they'd ceased to run while we were there. So long story short, the lovely manager of the co-op decided to shut the shop, borrow her dad's car, who was about 87, borrow his car and his sheep trailer. She loaded our bikes into the sheep trailer and shut the shop up, and was so happy to drive us to our next hostel, which was lovely because, she didn't have to do that. But she didn't want any money for petrol. She was so happy to do it. That was probably the biggest sort of worry, really, because it was, it was bitterly cold, and the winds were so strong, even on a downhill, you had to pedal to get down. We weren't being lightweight. It was awful weather.
Presumably you weren't carrying tents and camping equipment with you in your panniers. Obviously, if you do carry tents, etc., it gives you the extra flexibility of wild camping wherever you happen
Yeah.
to stop. Do you think it
Yeah.
would have been possible to do it if you hadn't booked your accommodation and all the ferries in advance, which would have given you that flexibility of not having to get to a certain point? But do you think there would have been a risk that either you wouldn't have got on a ferry, or you wouldn't have found the accommodation, or you wouldn't have been able to get into the accommodation?
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? I would have liked to have had tents with us. I love camping, but my two friends are less keen. So that was a decision we made at the start, that we were going to book into accommodation. I would have preferred maybe to have had a tent with us and gone wild camping. Having said that, the weather was pretty awful, and it was really nice to be in a dry hostel with a lovely bath. Difficult one, isn't it? Because it's extra weight as well. So, and actually I loved living out of a pannier. It just makes you realise how much rubbish you have at home and you don't need. That was one of the most enjoyable things for me, was having your little precious things that you've decided you're going to carry, and you need so little, don't you? You absolutely need so little. It's funny because my friends, we both really love butter. We actually had a conversation about, were we prepared to buy a block of butter and carry it around with us in our panniers because of the extra weight? We both agreed we did. So yeah, we carried a block of butter around with us.
So when you look back on the week, 10 days you spent travelling up there and along the islands and then back down to, in your case, Berkshire, what are the most memorable things that come to mind?
The beautiful, beautiful beaches and the scenery. I mean, the wildflowers, the macaw. It's worth deviating and doing the coastal routes, because the Hebridean Way doesn't always take you along those paths. So the wildflowers are beautiful. The beaches were stunning. As I say, we came across these beautiful little jellyfish, which I've never seen before in my life, and they were literally magical. But what also made it memorable were the incidents. I mean, you know, it was so lovely of that woman to rescue us, and I don't think you would get that on the mainland. But the people just went out of their way to help. So beautiful place you must go and eat, the Temple Cafe. You have to book it. It's absolutely beautiful. It's on the Isle of Harris. Amazing food. But we stayed in an Airbnb, and we're on our way to the Airbnb, realised we hadn't got any wine to take to our meal, caught the supermarket just in time. Long story short, we ended up going to this cafe. We got a lift off our Airbnb lady, Paula. Realised when we got there, we'd left the flipping wine, which we'd cycled crazily for. So she was so lovely. She said, "Oh, don't worry about that. I'll go back and get it." So not only did she take us out for our meal, she went back, got our red wine, delivered it back to the cafe, and then came to pick us up at the end. So yeah, everyone's really helpful, and there's a real strong sort of community support network there.
That must class as an emergency, surely.
Absolutely.
Buying a bottle of wine and then not having access to it to drink it, that kind of rockets itself up above anything else in terms of emergency situations, I would have thought.
Absolutely. Well, you should have seen the locals' faces when we brought the wine in the first place. It was literally the shop shut really early. So I think we'd got till about 4:00. Realised it was 10:02 and we hadn't got any wine. So we literally jumped on a bike, shot down to this co-op, whatever it was, went running in looking for the red wine, shelf, and the sort of locals who kind of didn't know what to hit them, ran in, bought the wine, ran out, and that was it. But yeah, you're right. You've got to have your red wine, haven't you?
Perhaps they thought they were being raided by three women from England.
Actually, saying being raided. So that was our final day. I don't know how you're coming back from the Hebrides, but we ended up getting the ferry from Lochboysdale to Mallaig. So the ferry's 3 hours, and then we got the 5-hour train journey to Oban. So you can imagine we're arriving in Oban, it's 9:30, 10 o'clock. We've still got half an hour cycle ride to find our Airbnb. And we were absolutely shattered. This is 12 days of, cycling, 5-hour, 8-hour travelling. So we were trying to find the Airbnb in the dark. And it was a bit unfortunate that the Airbnb, there was 2 Airbnbs going on in the same house. So this poor young couple, we were all wearing our luminous jackets. We've got like cycle lights on our helmets. We look like a police raid squad. Anyway, we went in this Airbnb and we were creeping around because it was obviously 10 o'clock, no lights on, trying to find if we were in the right house, never mind the right room. My friend carefully sort of opened this door with her full beam still on from her head, from a torch on her head, and she sort of lit up the face of this poor couple who's obviously were in the other Airbnb. So I mean that was hilarious for us, possibly not for them, but it's just all those little stories, isn't it, that just really make an adventure. Not necessarily all the good ones, but I think when times get hard, it makes it more memorable as well, doesn't it? So we were absolutely knackered. All we wanted was to go to sleep. But we were struggling to find our correct Airbnb, and unfortunately invited ourselves into this poor other couple's Airbnb. But anyway, we met them in the morning for breakfast and it was all good. So.
And if you were to do it again, what would you do differently?
Oh, that's a really good question. And I would really like to do it again. I would go from start to finish. Frustratingly, we didn't get to the top, which is Lewis, isn't it? So we didn't get to explore Lewis. And actually Harris and the more remote part, that's the more remote part of the route. So we definitely explore more up there. I think I would take longer and I would camp. I would wild camp. I think that would take away the pressure of having to be somewhere. And at the same time, wow, to wake up on one of those beaches just would be amazing. It's such a beautiful place. Don't forget your midgie net there, Andrew. We do you know what? We only needed it once, actually, because it was windy and awful weather. The midgies weren't out, but the day they were out, we did need it. And make sure I got right up to the top, because we didn't complete the whole way. There's just so much there, there were the standing stones and lots of the weaving. We didn't get time to explore those things, more of the arts, that goes on the islands.
And your two friends, are they now smitten by cycle touring, or are they back to cruising around the Med?
I'm not sure they've ever been on a bike ever since. No, to be fair, I think they have done some gentle cycling, but funnily enough, they've not asked me to come on another trip with them.
Right, okay, that's brilliant. Thank you for that. And have you got another cycling trip planned yourself at any time?
I don't know. Just been doing local. I did. Yes, I did the Cambrian Way up in Wales. Have you heard of that route?
I haven't. I've done the Long Last Cymru, but I've never heard of the Cambrian Way.
Well, we kind of signed up for a sort of a lead ride, which we've never done before. So we went with a group of people. This was a couple of months ago. Weirdly, the weather was absolutely pants again. We'd had stunning weather before it, and then I think it was another 40, 50 mile an hour winds and torrential rain. But it was a 3-day cycling trip over the Cambrian Mountains, and that again is absolutely beautiful. If you don't know the Elan Valley or around that area, I would check it out, because I need to go back and complete that as well. Unfortunately, we bailed out of that one on the second day because the conditions were hell. It was really tough.
I think when it comes to the weather, you've got to bear in mind, if you look at people's Instagram pictures and Twitter posts and websites and what have you, people always avoid taking photographs in rubbish weather. They only take good photographs in decent weather when it's a blue sky. And you've got to bear that in mind when you're experiencing really dreadful conditions. Everybody has really dreadful conditions. The filter of social media means that you only ever see the pictures that were taken on the days when it was blue sky and everybody's smiling.
That is so true. That so sums up that last trip we did. And I was a sucker for it, because I'd looked at it's a stunning website, and the company have got a beautiful little short video, sailing over the mountains, the sky's blue, everyone's smiling, and it couldn't have been, it was a polar opposite when we went. It was like a mud fest. It was, I mean, we were pushing bikes up mud slopes, literally 1 in 25. It was, yeah, I've learned that lesson. Imagine that video in mud.
Right, okay, well, thank you for that. That's brilliant, and good luck on your next trip.
Yeah, so you go the 16th of August?
16th. Yeah, I bought my ticket. I'm off on the 16th. Yeah. I've got my place on the train, got my place on the ferry, booked the youth hostel in Oban, then get the ferry across on the 17th in the morning. And then, well, nothing, taking a very different approach to what you did. Nothing is booked. I've kind of created my little map online with all my things where I could stop while camping, hostels. Obviously, COVID is an issue at the moment.
Yeah.
So that's got to be dealt with. I'm hopefully I'm going to kind of have to wing it.
I'm really fascinated to see how that pans out, because I definitely would like to go back. So please do a podcast. And a truthful one though.
Yeah, that will. Well, with a podcast, you can't put any blue sky on podcast.
No, that's true. But maybe you post some proper true life.
But Sue, it's going to be blue skies for 12 days. So how can I possibly do that?
Yeah, it probably will. Have a great time.
Thank you. And that's it for episode 38 of the Cycling Europe podcast. Thanks to Sue and her two friends and all the people we heard from earlier. As I mentioned at the end of my chat with Sue, my plan is to set off by train from my home in West Yorkshire on August 16th with the intention of cycling the length of the Hebridean Way before the end of the month. Hopefully episode 39 will tell the story of me doing just that. As I cycle, I'll be posting updates to my website cyclingeurope.org, as well as photographs and videos on social media at Cycling Europe on Twitter and Instagram, or at cyclingeurope.org on Facebook. I'll also be talking about cycling the Hebridean Way at the monthly online Cycle Touring Festival talk on Thursday the 30th of September. Details of how to sign up for that talk can be found at cycletouringfestival.co.uk. August talk, by the way, which takes place on Thursday the 26th, is being given by Tim Sanders, who is going to be talking about cycling Chile's Carretera Austral in late 2019 and early 2020. If you've enjoyed this episode of the podcast, please consider taking a few moments to rate or even review the Cycling Europe podcast on the platform where you're listening. Remember that you can now support the website and the podcast financially by visiting cyclingeurope.org/support. Thanks if you do, it's much appreciated. And if you'd like to get in touch with your own cycle touring story, you can email podcast@cyclingeurope.org. Thanks for listening and happy cycling.